Hey everybody, welcome to my project for policy analysis. For this project, I chose DPHHS's budget cuts to adult mental health case management in Montana. So these cuts originated out of a budget shortfall of 227 million following a very expensive fire season of 2017. You'll also find some sources that, although there's very few, that'll point to unrealistic budget projections from the last regular session as part of the reason that we had such a shortfall. So once they realized there was this shortfall, the governor ordered DPHHS to cut a significant amount of money out of their operations. They chose to propose a 3% cut to all Medicaid services, and then initially proposed a pretty significant cut to adult case management. Here I've got 55% on this screen, but that was after the second proposal, which was even deeper. Initially they proposed somewhere around 45% cut. So after a lot of objection to these cuts, there was some listening sessions. Hundreds of people turned out: providers, consumers, all advocates in places like NAMI. So after the opposition, and there was an interim committee that actually formally objected and halted the cuts. They convened for a special session, at which point they upheld the cuts. They decided not to increase revenue and to stick with cuts. So the governor then continued to order DPHHS to cut its budget. So the cuts were implemented. And so to the literature review, what I found is there's pretty significant evidence to support the efficacy of adult case management for people with severe and disabling mental illness. There's not a lot that pertains specifically to my analysis, but there is some studies that suggest in a medical model that money can be saved by care management. Also, one really important study was this University of Kansas study, where they, for a 6-month period, provided case management services. These were students in the social work program that were providing these. And they found that during that 6-month period, admissions to their county psychiatric hospital were reduced by 20%. So it's pretty easy to see how this would lead to cost savings, because operating a psychiatric hospital is incredibly expensive. And again, care management in hospitals is something that's been practiced for a long time, and it's been shown to save money. That's why it exists. So my methods for analysis, here I've got NPS, but it should be NPF for Narrative Policy Framework. I used that and a content analysis to analyze news articles. So what I did is I searched Google News. I took the first 20 articles that popped up regarding this issue. I typed in DPHHS budget cuts Montana DPHHS budget cuts to case management. From there, I identified in a narrative in each of those articles. I identified victims, villains, heroes, and preceding issues. And then once I did all that, I asked a final research question: is the narrative congruent with the policy that was implemented? Some of my findings, the narrative that I discovered was quite unified and quite dominant, but it did not actually lead to a policy that was congruent. So now I'm going to go through a few findings. Villains, largely DPHHS was seen as a villain. 50% of the time, DPHHS was named as the only villain. State legislators were named in 5 articles, and then in the remaining 5, they were both named. So actually 15 out of these 20 DPHHS was named, and state legislators the remainder. Victims, service consumers were largely named, obviously. I think that goes without saying. One article did mention service providers because of all the job loss, and then 5 articles mentioned both. So that's a pretty dominant that service consumers are the victims in these narratives. As far as heroes, it's still pretty stacked in service providers. They 60% of the time were named as the heroes in these narratives. Advocates were only named 3 times, both once, and 4 articles where nobody was identified as a hero because they didn't have any solutions and were not saving the victims. But still, here again on this slide, you can see that there's a pretty strong narrative about service providers being the heroes. Lastly, the preceding issue. I thought this was important because different politicians will name different things: fire season, revenue shortfall, both. The revenue shortfall definitely was the dominant narrative here. Both were named twice. 2017 fire season, although it was mentioned in conjunction with a revenue shortfall, was never actually blamed alone for the cuts. And again, like I said earlier, there was, you'll find some articles that'll talk about the unrealistic budget projections, but it was not a dominant theme in the articles I looked at. So then the final research question: was it congruent with the policy? I found it was not congruent with the policy whatsoever. So then I asked myself, what was more important than these narratives? Well, I think it's very important to look at how this narrative was formed. You've got a pretty diverse crowd of people, including citizens, advocates, providers, and they formed this coalition very quickly and had a very unified voice on what they thought about these cuts. And I also got me thinking, what does this say about our current government? Is our government elitist? Are they not relying on representative democracy and pluralism and leaning on elitism to make their decisions? Also, should we expect similar budgetary emergencies with costly fire seasons? If they're not building this into their budget, what should we expect as citizens? And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, what about these budget projections? Are they going to enter the narrative at some point? Are we going to hold politicians accountable for creating a budget that makes sense? So these are some of the implications I found most important. It looks like I'm going a little long here, so I will finish up. That is my project, and I thank you for watching, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.